In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was a terrifying spectacle of power. Endless columns of tanks rumbled through Red Square. Legions of soldiers marched in perfect unison. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, capable of ending the world, paraded past the Kremlin as a warning to the West. From the outside, the USSR looked like a permanent, unshakable force, a superpower made of steel and concrete. But inside the Soviet Union, a different reality was unfolding. It was a reality of silence, of waiting, of emptiness. It was the reality of the grocery store shelf. While the state showed off its missiles, its citizens were lining up for hours hoping for bread, sausage, or a pair of shoes that fit. The shelves were bare. The world was shocked when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. How could a military giant that had terrified the world for 50 years just disappear? The answer wasn't in their military strategy or their political speeches. The answer was hidden in plain sight, in the quiet desperation of those empty shelves. Recently declassified economic reports from the final years of the USSR, documents never meant for public eyes, tell the real story. They show a state that was not a mighty giant, but a hollow giant, rotting from the inside out. It was an empire of lies, where official statistics were a fantasy, and the real economy of making and moving things had already died. This isn't just a story about the past. The patterns of failure described in those secret Soviet reports, the manipulated numbers, the decaying industry, the broken supply chains, are eerily similar to the cracks now appearing in the United States. The story of the Soviet Union's empty shelves is a warning. It's a warning that the illusion of economic strength is the most dangerous illusion of all. To understand the collapse, you first have to understand the machine that caused it: central planning. In a normal market economy, nobody is in charge. Prices and demand act like invisible signals that tell businesses what to make. If everyone wants to buy a certain type of car, its price goes up, and car companies make more of them to meet that demand. It's a messy, chaotic, but surprisingly effective system for getting people what they want. The Soviet Union tried to do the opposite. They believed a small group of brilliant planners in Moscow could run the entire economy more efficiently than the chaos of the market. This was the command economy. From an office in the capital, a government agency called Gosplan would decide everything. They would decide how many tons of steel to produce, how many pairs of shoes to manufacture, how many acres of wheat to plant, and where it all should go. In theory, it was a perfect, rational system. In reality, it was a catastrophe. The first problem was information. An economy is unbelievably complex. There are billions of products, billions of needs, and billions of individual decisions happening every second. The Soviet planners were completely overwhelmed. They received reports the size of telephone books from every corner of the empire, containing millions of numbers they couldn't possibly process. One Soviet computer scientist predicted it would take the entire population of the USSR just to administer the plan. But even worse than having too much data was having the wrong data. The planners knew how many shoes a factory produced, but they had no idea if people actually wanted those shoes, if they were the right size, or if they were good quality. A market economy gets this feedback instantly through sales and prices. The Soviet system was blind. It had no way of knowing what people truly needed or desired. This blindness led to the most famous feature of the Soviet economy: its absurdity. Since factory managers were judged not on selling products, but on meeting quotas set by the planners, they did whatever it took to hit their numbers, with disastrous results. This is a concept called malicious compliance. If a chandelier factory was given a quota based on the weight of chandeliers it produced, the manager would simply make them heavier and heavier each year, until they were so heavy they could pull ceilings down. If a shoe factory was told to produce a certain number of shoes, the manager might make them all in children's sizes because they used less leather and were faster to make, even if there were no children who needed them. The stories are endless and almost comical. Empty trains were run on pointless journeys across the country simply because the plan demanded that train mileage had to increase every year. The Soviet whaling fleet slaughtered 180,000 whales, driving some species to the brink of extinction, not because there was a demand for whale meat, most of it was left to rot in the sea, but because the plan had a quota for whales, and the quota had to be met at any price. In this system, the factory's real customer was not the person who bought the product. The real customer was the state. The goal was to satisfy the plan, not the public. This created an economy that was brilliant at producing statistics, but terrible at producing value. It was an empire of numbers, not things. For decades, the West could only guess at how bad the rot was. But now we have the internal reports. Declassified CIA analyses and formerly secret Soviet documents from the 1980s paint a picture of an economy in its final death spiral. The official story was one of growth. The secret reality was stagnation. A 1982 U.S. intelligence report stated that Soviet economic growth was expected to fall below 2% per year, and that productivity, the efficiency of its factories and workers, had been falling substantially since 1975. By 1988, The CIA concluded that the economy's performance was no better than the lackluster results achieved in the early 1980s, a period the Soviet leaders themselves later called the era of stagnation. The machine was grinding to a halt. A huge reason for this was the crushing weight of the Soviet military. From the 1960s through the 1980s, the Soviet Union consistently spent between 14% and 17% of its entire economic output, its GDP, on defense. To understand how massive this is, consider that the United States today, with the largest military budget in the world, spends around 3.4% of its GDP on defense. The Soviets were spending nearly 5 times that share. This wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It meant that the best scientists, the most skilled engineers, and the most advanced materials were all being funneled into the military. While the West was developing microchips for personal computers, the Soviets were developing them for missile guidance systems. While the West was innovating in consumer goods, the Soviets were innovating in tank armor. This created a permanent guns versus butter problem. The state was so obsessed with producing guns that there was almost nothing left over to produce butter. Declassified reports from the time openly discussed this, noting that continued rapid growth in defense spending can be maintained only at the expense of investment growth in the civilian economy. The result was a modern military superpower with a civilian economy that couldn't produce a decent washing machine. The store shelves were empty because everything the country was good at making was being sent to the army. But the final fatal blow to the Soviet system wasn't just its inefficiency or its military spending. It was the collapse of the one thing that held it all together, the supply chain. Because everything was centrally planned, the Soviet economy was like one giant continent-spanning factory. A single finished product, like a tractor, might be assembled in Russia, using an engine from Ukraine, tires from Belarus, and steel from Kazakhstan. For decades, this complex web of interdependency worked more or less because Moscow controlled everything. But in the late 1980s, the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, introduced reforms called perestroika, or restructuring. He wanted to modernize the economy by giving the different Soviet republics and state-owned companies more freedom, but he didn't realize he was pulling the threads that would unravel the entire system. As the republics began to demand more independence, the tightly integrated supply chains began to break. A factory in Lithuania might suddenly find that its supplier in Russia was no longer sending parts. A clothing company in Kazakhstan that used to get fabric from Uzbekistan and zippers from Russia suddenly had neither. The entire system seized up. The problem wasn't that the factories disappeared. The problem was that the connections between them were severed. The trade networks that had been dictated by Moscow for 70 years collapsed almost overnight. The result was what economists call disorganization. Factories stood idle because they couldn't get raw materials. Finished goods sat in warehouses because the transportation system was in chaos, and the store shelves became completely empty. The Soviet Union didn't just run out of things to sell, it lost the ability to get things from where they were made to where they were needed. It was a total logistical collapse. The superpower didn't get defeated, it just stopped working. This story is a chilling piece of history. But it becomes truly terrifying when you realize the same patterns are emerging in the United States today. First, consider the official statistics. The Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own lies. Its official reports claimed growth and stability, while the reality was decay and shortages. Today in the United States, we are told by the Federal Reserve that the target for inflation is 2%. But for millions of Americans struggling with the soaring cost of housing, food, and energy, that number feels like a fantasy, completely disconnected from their daily lives. Just like in the Soviet Union, there's a growing gap between the official story told by the numbers and the lived reality of the people. Second, look at the industrial decay. The Soviet industrial base rotted from within because it was inefficient and starved of resources by the military. The American industrial base has been hollowed out for a different reason: offshoring. For decades, U.S. companies moved their factories to other countries to take advantage of cheap labor. The China shock of the 2000s was particularly devastating. As low-cost imports from China flooded the country, entire American industries like textiles, furniture, and electronics were wiped out. Between 2001 and 2018, the growing trade deficit with China was responsible for the loss of 3.7 million U.S. jobs, 2.8 million of them in manufacturing. While this may have led to cheaper consumer goods for a time, it left the country with a hollowed-out industrial core, dependent on its geopolitical rivals for essential products. The empty factories of the American Rust Belt are a monument to this decay, just as the empty shelves were in the Soviet Union. Finally, and most alarmingly, consider the fragility of the supply chain. The Soviet system was brittle because it was too centralized. The American system is brittle because it is too globalized. For decades, companies built just-in-time supply chains that were incredibly efficient, but had zero room for error. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed this weakness for the entire world to see. Suddenly, the United States, the wealthiest country on Earth, couldn't get basic medical supplies like masks, gloves, and gowns because the factories that made them were all overseas. The global shortage of semiconductors, a tiny component essential for everything from cars to computers, brought entire industries to a standstill. The pandemic revealed that America's shelves could also go empty. It showed that a deep dependency on global supply chains meant that a crisis in one part of the world could lead to shortages in another. Today, surveys show that a huge majority of companies feel vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, whether from geopolitical events, trade wars, or natural disasters. The system is stretched to its breaking point. The Soviet Union collapsed not because it was invaded by an enemy army, but because its internal economic reality no longer matched its external image of power. The official numbers were a fantasy, and the physical economy, the system of making things and moving them to where they were needed, had broken down. The warning for the United States is not that it will become a communist state. The warning is that it is showing the same symptoms of a fatal disconnect, a disconnect between official statistics and the real-life struggles of its citizens, a disconnect between its financial economy and its decaying industrial base, and a disconnect between its dependence on global supply chains and the growing instability of the world. The empty shelves of the Soviet Union are a ghost of a possible future. They are a warning that no country, no matter how powerful it seems, can survive when its physical economy rots from within. The numbers on a screen are meaningless if you can't get the goods on the shelf.